The galaxy had barely begun to adjust to humanity's decision to leave the Galactic Council, and already the first signs of panic were starting to show. At first, it had been small, subtle disruptions that could have been brushed off. But the longer humanity remained outside the Council's influence, the more unsettling the situation became. Planets that once thrived in peaceful cooperation found themselves struggling to maintain control. Trade routes, once reliable and predictable, began to face delays. Ships from different sectors started disappearing without explanation, and communication between distant systems became erratic. It wasn't just a few isolated incidents anymore. The cracks in the foundation of the galaxy were beginning to widen. The galactic marketplace, a bustling network of planets and stations that exchanged goods, was in turmoil. Merchants began to panic. Some goods were no longer arriving on time, and entire shipments were going missing. The Zorak, one of the oldest and most powerful species in the galaxy, watched the news unfold with growing concern. They had always seen themselves as the true masters of the galaxy, using their psychic abilities and mental manipulation to maintain their influence. But even they couldn't ignore the unease that was spreading across the universe. Their once solid control over the galaxy was faltering, and it was no longer certain that they could hold the system together. Other species, the ones who had depended on the Galactic Council's influence to keep the peace, were beginning to feel vulnerable. The smaller, less powerful races started to question everything they had once known. Was the galaxy truly safe without the stability of the Galactic Council? What would happen if the Zorak or Shellac took over, fighting for control in a way that would leave the weaker races vulnerable? It wasn't long before these smaller factions started hoarding resources, stockpiling weapons, and building their own defenses. Fear was spreading like a wildfire, and no one knew what to expect next. In the core worlds, things were even worse. The systems that had always felt secure under the protection of the Council now found themselves exposed. The sudden uncertainty left entire planets shaken. The news of missing ships and unstable trade routes reached the high councils of every planet. Political leaders, who had once been able to sit comfortably under the banner of the Galactic Council, were now scrambling for answers. Every faction was looking for ways to secure their own future, no one sure of how long the peace could last. The idea of unity, which had always been a pillar of the Galactic Council, was quickly fading. The Zorak, always quick to see an opportunity in chaos, began to assess how they could take advantage of the situation. For centuries, their psychic powers had allowed them to manipulate the minds of weaker species. Now, with the power of the Galactic Council diminished, they saw a chance to extend their influence even further. But even the Zorak felt a growing sense of dread. They could sense something was off. Their mental networks, which had always been a source of strength, were beginning to flicker. Their powers weren't as sharp as they had been. It was as if something was interfering with their abilities. They couldn't put their finger on it, but it was a disturbing thought. Something beyond their control was happening, and they couldn't understand what. Across the galaxy, other species felt it too. The Shellac, known for their military might, were next to take notice. They had been preparing for expansion, eager to seize control of new territories, now that the Galactic Council's grip had loosened. But their war machine was not functioning as it should. Ships began to experience unexplained malfunctions, engines failed unexpectedly, and entire fleets were forced to retreat from battle zones due to mysterious technical issues. Systems that should have worked perfectly were failing, and the Shellac were helpless in the face of it. They couldn't explain the strange phenomena, but the effect was undeniable. Their greatest strength, their military superiority, was now in jeopardy. Fear was spreading rapidly. What had once been a well-ordered galaxy, ruled by a fragile peace brokered by the Galactic Council, was now teetering on the brink of chaos. As trade routes became increasingly unstable, the flow of resources to distant planets slowed to a crawl. Economic systems were breaking down, and with it, the carefully constructed peace of the galaxy. The Shellac, Zorak, and countless other factions began to make uneasy alliances, but no one trusted anyone anymore. It wasn't just a political crisis. It was a galactic emergency. The smaller species were now realizing that their survival didn't depend solely on trade or military power. As the galaxy started to fall apart, they began to see the truth. They were now on their own. They couldn't rely on the Galactic Council to shield them from the storms of war and power struggles. No one could protect them. There were whispers of disaster on the horizon, that the universe was spiraling into something far darker, but no one knew what was causing it. Were these disruptions just the result of humanity's departure, or was there something more insidious at play? In the background, strange phenomena began to intensify. Mysterious energy surges, entire star systems flickering out of existence. It wasn't just the political and economic collapse that had the galaxy on edge. It was the strange, inexplicable forces that seemed to be affecting everything. Some believed it was simply the natural course of the galaxy. Things would return to normal soon enough. But for many, the events unfolding were a sign of something far worse. Something had been set into motion the moment humanity walked away from the Galactic Council, and whatever it was growing stronger with every passing day. The first signs of panic weren't just about missing ships, failing trade routes, or the breakdown of political order. They were the beginning of something much bigger, a realization that the galaxy was on the edge of a precipice, and no one knew how far it would fall. Everyone was beginning to realize the truth. Humanity's departure from the Galactic Council wasn't just a political decision. It was a catalyst, a spark that had ignited something far beyond anyone's control. As fear spread, one question echoed across the galaxy. What had humanity done? The signs of panic that began to ripple through the galaxy were just the beginning. As days passed, those early disturbances snowballed into something far darker. Trade routes, once flowing smoothly across countless sectors, became increasingly unreliable. Ships that had always been punctual started to disappear without a trace. Entire convoys were lost to unknown forces. Cargo that was meant to be delivered to thriving colonies and distant planets simply didn't arrive. The galaxy was unraveling, piece by piece, and no one could explain why. At first, the larger species, those who held the power, were reluctant to admit the full extent of the problem. The Zorak, with their vast psychic influence, brushed off the disruptions as a temporary issue. They believed that the galaxy would settle down on its own, just as it always had. But deep down, they knew something was off. Their once stable control over the galaxy seemed to be slipping through their fingers. Their mental networks, the very thing that allowed them to manipulate weaker species and control vast territories, were starting to flicker. They couldn't pinpoint the cause, but their connection to the galaxy's energy seemed to be weakening. The Zorak were not alone in their concern. The Shelek, ever watchful of their military dominance, were facing their own set of problems. Their massive warships, once a symbol of unchallenged strength, began to experience strange mechanical failures. It started with minor glitches, communication systems going down, navigational systems acting erratically, but quickly escalated. Entire fleets found themselves stranded in deep space, unable to return to their home planets. The war machine that had been so reliable was now breaking down, piece by piece. The Shelek leaders were furious, but even they could sense something larger at work. As panic spread, smaller, more vulnerable species began to react in ways that had never been seen before. These were the species that had relied on the stability the Galactic Council had brought. Now that humanity had walked away, and the Council was no longer an effective governing body, the smaller races had no idea where to turn. Fear set in. What would happen if the Zorak or the Shelek decided to take advantage of the situation? What if the galaxy was on the brink of war? Even those who had once been neutral, focusing on commerce and exploration, started to build defensive systems around their planets. Resources were hoarded, alliances were formed in secret, and the once unified galaxy splintered into factions. The political landscape was rapidly changing, and no one knew what would happen next. The most alarming issue, however, wasn't just the chaos on the surface. there was something else. Something deeper, something more dangerous. Across the galaxy, whispers of strange cosmic events began to surface. Entire star systems had inexplicably gone silent. Energy surges and fluctuations in spacetime were being detected by the most advanced scanners. Planets, once teeming with life, now faced sudden, unexplained droughts and resource shortages. On other planets, strange storms raged for days without warning. The laws of nature seemed to be breaking down. At first, these anomalies were dismissed as coincidental, but as they grew more frequent, the galaxy's fear reached new heights. Some believed these strange occurrences were linked to the sudden collapse of the Galactic Council. After all, it wasn't just humanity's departure that had shaken the universe. It was the breakdown of the entire system that had held everything together. No one had predicted the consequences of such a bold decision. No one had realized that removing humanity from the equation would set off a chain reaction that could bring the galaxy to its knees. Even as the crisis deepened, the larger species continued to squabble among themselves, pointing fingers at each other and refusing to cooperate. The Zorak accused the Shellac of causing the disruptions, while the Shellac blamed the Zorak for their failing warships. Meanwhile, the smaller species, once content to remain neutral, began to prepare for what seemed like the inevitable: war. It wasn't just that trade was falling apart, or that the military might of the galaxy was crumbling. It was the fact that something was stirring, something that had been dormant for millennia. Ancient records from long-forgotten civilizations spoke of an unknown force, an entity that fed on chaos, fear, and the very fabric of space itself. No one knew exactly what it was, but the growing anomalies across the galaxy seemed to be tied to its presence. It was as though the universe itself was reacting to the instability created by humanity's bold decision to leave the Council. As weeks turned into months, things only grew worse. The once proud galactic powers found themselves weakened, their leaders scrambling to maintain order. Smaller factions, too, felt the sting of the chaos as their planets became less and less secure. Families fled their homes, traders shut down their operations, and military forces went on high alert. The galaxy that had once been united in peaceful cooperation was now fractured, each faction looking out for their own survival. But the worst part was the feeling of inevitability that began to settle over the galaxy. There was no real leadership anymore, and no one could even agree on what the problem was, let alone how to fix it. The situation was so far beyond anyone's control that it seemed as if the galaxy was simply doomed to fall apart. And as they stood on the precipice of total collapse, the question began to echo through the minds of every living being: what had humanity done? The galaxy's descent into chaos continued to spiral further out of control. As the weeks passed, the panic deepened, and no one seemed to have an explanation for what was happening. At first, it had been mere disruptions, small, isolated incidents that could be brushed off as accidents. But now, the problem was undeniable. The systems were breaking down, and no one could stop it. For the Zorak, who had long prided themselves on their mental prowess and dominance, the situation was becoming increasingly dire. They had relied on their psychic networks to maintain order and stability, controlling the galaxy through fear and manipulation. But with every passing day, the Zorak's powers seemed to weaken. Their once impressive psychic abilities, which allowed them to influence entire sectors of space, were beginning to flicker. Communication across vast distances became more difficult, and their ability to control others through mental domination was rapidly diminishing. It wasn't just a simple loss of power. It felt like something was actively blocking their influence. The Zorak's mental channels had always been reliable, a tool they had used for centuries to ensure their dominance in the galaxy. But now, as their grip on the galaxy loosened, something was stirring in the void, something beyond their understanding. It was as if the very fabric of space itself was rejecting their presence. The Zorak weren't alone in feeling the disturbance. The Shellac, one of the galaxy's most powerful militaristic species, also began to experience the effects of the growing instability. For them, The failure of their war machine was the most pressing issue. Their fleets, once unstoppable, were now crippled by unexplained malfunctions. Massive warships, built to crush any opposition, began to break down in the middle of operations. Entire battle fleets found themselves stranded in space, unable to navigate or communicate. Some ships simply vanished without a trace, leaving behind only the eerie silence of empty space. The Shellac leadership, usually composed and calculating, was now in full-blown panic. They called for emergency meetings, seeking answers from their engineers and military officers. But no one had a reasonable explanation for the failures. The technology that had once made the Shellac an unstoppable force was now turning against them. Their once proud war machine had become a liability, and the galaxy began to see cracks in their military might. It was a blow to their pride, and they knew that the other species were watching, waiting for an opportunity to strike. Meanwhile, the smaller species, the ones who had long relied on the protection and stability the Galactic Council provided, were struggling to adapt to the new, uncertain reality. The Vorgan, a peaceful and highly intellectual species, had once thrived under the Council's umbrella, but now they found themselves vulnerable to the growing chaos. Their homeworld was on the edge of the galactic frontier, and they had always relied on trade routes for their economy. But now these trade routes were being disrupted, and their once secure systems were being threatened by marauding factions. The Vorgan were no longer safe. Fear began to spread among the smaller species. No one knew who to trust anymore. The once great Galactic Council had disbanded, and the universe that had been carefully managed for centuries now felt like a chaotic, lawless place. Planetary leaders who had once sat side by side in peace talks now found themselves at odds, suspicious of one another's intentions. Alliances that had once seemed unbreakable were now crumbling, and new factions were rising up, seeking power in the wake of the Council's collapse. In every corner of the galaxy, the signs of instability were becoming impossible to ignore. Entire sectors were without leadership. Communication between systems had grown increasingly erratic, with entire colonies becoming cut off from the rest of the galaxy. Without the Council to mediate, no one was sure where the next conflict would arise, or how long it would take before the entire galaxy descended into war. But the true scale of the threat wasn't just the breakdown of order. It was something much darker. Strange phenomena had begun to occur across the galaxy, and no one could explain them. Entire planets would vanish from star maps, as if they had been erased from existence. Ships, once thought to be safe and stable, would mysteriously disappear during their journeys. It wasn't just the technology failing. It was as if the universe itself was rejecting these ships, these planets, and even the very laws of nature. At first, many believed that these strange occurrences were the result of some natural disaster or cosmic anomaly. But as they continued, it became clear that something far more sinister was at play. Some whispered that the ancient force, the dark entity spoken of in forgotten myths, had awoken. It was said to be an ancient being, a creature that fed on the chaos and fear that had now engulfed the galaxy. Its return had been predicted for millennia, and some believed that humanity's departure from the Galactic Council had been the trigger that had awoken it from its slumber. The galaxy, once a place of harmony and cooperation, was now teetering on the edge of destruction. The systems that had once been the backbone of the Galactic Council were now falling apart. Planets were starting to turn against one another. The larger species, the Zorak and the Shellac, were too distracted by their own crises to focus on maintaining control. And the smaller species, once content to live in the shadow of the Council, were now scrambling to secure their own futures. Fear and uncertainty had become the new reality for every race in the galaxy, and as each day passed, the question remained, what had humanity's decision to leave the Galactic Council truly unleashed? The answer, it seemed, was becoming clearer. The galaxy was unraveling, and there was no telling how far the chaos would spread. As the Zorak, the Shellac, and every other species grappled with their failing systems and shifting allegiances, one thing became certain: The galaxy was on the brink of collapse, and no one knew how to stop it. The question that haunted every mind was simple. Would anyone be able to fix it before it was too late? And perhaps more terrifyingly, could they survive what was coming next? No one knew the answer, but one thing was certain. The galaxy would never be the same again. As the galaxy spiraled further into chaos, the situation grew increasingly dire. No one could deny the truth any longer. The universe, once stable under the rule of the Galactic Council, was beginning to fall apart. The larger, powerful species, the Zorak and the Shalak, found themselves struggling to maintain their influence, while the smaller factions fought desperately for survival. Panic spread like wildfire, and every sector of space felt the tremors of impending doom. The Zorak, whose psychic powers had once been a cornerstone of their dominance, were now facing an unprecedented challenge. The strange disruptions in their psychic abilities were only growing stronger. Their once vast and uncontested mental network had become erratic and unreliable, as if some invisible force was blocking their connection to the galaxy itself. In meetings of the highest order, the Zorak leaders, typically calm and composed, could no longer hide their growing fear. The whispers of something dark and ancient, an entity beyond their control, began to spread among them. Some believed it was a force of nature. Others claimed it was a manifestation of the chaos humanity had set into motion. But no one could explain why it was happening or how to stop it. Even the Zorak's once strong military might begin to falter. Their fleets, which had once terrorized their enemies and maintained dominance across the galaxy, were now falling apart. The ships, once unstoppable, started to malfunction at an alarming rate. Navigation systems that had always worked flawlessly suddenly failed mid-flight. The powerful weapons that had once given the Zorak an upper hand in battle began to malfunction. It was as though the fabric of reality itself was crumbling under the pressure of something far greater than anyone had anticipated. Across the galaxy, the Shelak were facing a similar crisis. Known for their unmatched military power, they had once been able to crush any opposition with ease. But now, their warships, massive, imposing machines of destruction, had become unreliable. Entire fleets were stranded in the void, unable to repair themselves due to mysterious malfunctions that no one could explain. Their engineers scrambled to understand what was happening, but they too were left with more questions than answers. The technology that had once made them invincible was now their greatest weakness. In the core worlds, the political landscape was disintegrating at a rapid pace. Planetary leaders, who had once relied on the Galactic Council's authority to maintain order, now found themselves struggling to keep their populations under control. Governments that had once been stable were now on the brink of collapse. Civil unrest erupted in every corner of the galaxy, as citizens and factions alike questioned the future. Without the central authority of the Galactic Council to mediate, entire systems were left vulnerable to warlords, mercenaries, and pirate groups who began to seize control of the most valuable resources. The smaller species, too, felt the growing pressure. Planets that had once been peaceful and prosperous now found themselves vulnerable to attacks from all sides. Trade routes that had been essential to their survival were now unreliable, and the once bustling economy of the galaxy was grinding to a halt. The Vorgan, a species once known for their intellectual prowess, began to retreat into isolation, building defenses around their homeworlds and stockpiling resources in preparation for the worst. They had never known a universe so unstable, so chaotic, and so full of fear. But even as the galaxy descended into anarchy, the most terrifying element remained the unknown force that seemed to be at the heart of it all. The strange anomalies, planets disappearing, energy surges, and space-time distortions were growing more frequent and more intense. Whole star systems blinked out of existence, and no one could explain why. The fabric of space seemed to be warping in ways that defied all logic. Ships that attempted to travel through certain sectors would suddenly find themselves lost, unable to escape the distortions that had taken hold. Across the galaxy, scientists and engineers worked tirelessly to understand what was happening. Theories ranged from natural cosmic events to the idea that humanity's exit from the Galactic Council had triggered some cosmic imbalance. But the more they studied, the more uncertain they became. There were whispers of an ancient power, a force older than the galaxy itself, that had been disturbed by humanity's actions. Some speculated that it was a dark energy, a malevolent entity that thrived on chaos and destruction, and that it had been awakened by the very act of humanity breaking away from the Council. As humanity's departure had sent shockwaves through the galaxy, it had inadvertently opened a door to something far more dangerous than anyone had realized. The galaxy's leaders, once filled with pride and power, now found themselves humbled by the sheer scale of the crisis. Entire civilizations were at risk of collapse, and the mysterious force that seemed to be at the root of it all was beyond their control. Some, like the Zorak and the Shalak, began to take extreme measures. Desperate for answers and desperate for control, they began to experiment with forbidden technologies and ancient rituals in an attempt to regain their grip on the galaxy. But these actions only seemed to intensify the cosmic disturbances, further destabilizing the universe. The small factions, those that had once stayed neutral, began to realize that the galaxy was beyond saving. They could no longer depend on the larger species for protection. They were on their own. As fear and desperation spread, the galaxy seemed to be slipping into a dark age, one that no one had predicted. The Galactic Council, once a beacon of peace and unity, was a distant memory. The universe was now a fractured, hostile place. As the galaxy's doom became more and more apparent, the question that haunted everyone was whether there was still hope. Was it possible to stop the chaos? Was there any way to reverse the destruction that had been set in motion? Or was the universe destined to fall into an endless spiral of fear, violence, and disorder? No one had the answers, and with every passing day, the galaxy seemed to be descending further into darkness, as if it were being consumed by a force far older and far more dangerous than anyone had ever imagined. The fate of the galaxy hung in the balance, and the only certainty was that the universe would never be the same again. The galaxy had reached its breaking point, and the signs of total collapse were unmistakable. Across the star systems, the political, military, and social order that had once held the universe together was now fractured beyond repair. Those who had once seen themselves as invincible, the Zorak, the Shalak, and the other dominant species, were now reduced to scrambling, desperate actions to retain whatever power they had left. And the smaller factions, who had once hoped for the protection of the Galactic Council, found themselves left to fend for themselves in a universe that had turned chaotic and unpredictable. The Zorak, once masters of psychic manipulation and control, had fallen into a state of confusion and disarray. Their psychic networks, those vast mental highways that had connected the galaxy in ways no other species could understand, were all but destroyed. It was as though the very fabric of reality had begun to reject their influence. Even their ability to communicate with each other through telepathy had become fragmented and distorted, leaving them unable to coordinate, let alone control, the galaxy's affairs. Their sense of superiority was fading, replaced by a sense of helplessness that gnawed at them from within. The Shalak, for their part, were clinging to their military might, but even their massive warships, which had once been the galaxy's most formidable force, were no longer reliable. Entire fleets, in the midst of operations, had been struck by crippling malfunctions. Weapons that had once been able to lay waste to entire colonies now misfired or failed entirely. Ships that had been regarded as invincible were now stranded in space, unable to return to their home planets or communicate with the outside world. Their once unstoppable war machine had become a symbol of their collapse. Meanwhile, the smaller species were caught in the crossfire, struggling to survive in a universe that was becoming more dangerous with each passing day. Trade routes, once the backbone of the galaxy's economy, were now unreliable. The once thriving sectors that had been built on intergalactic commerce were now little more than ghost towns. The Vorgan, a peaceful and intellectual species, found themselves retreating into isolation, locking down their homeworld, and cutting off contact with the rest of the galaxy. They had always been a species of reason, but now, with the galaxy teetering on the edge of war, reason seemed to be in short supply. No one could say for certain what would happen next. No one knew what the future would hold for them. The most terrifying part, however, was the force that seemed to be at the root of it all, the cosmic disturbance that had begun to affect the very fabric of space-time itself. Strange phenomena were now appearing across the galaxy. Planets that had once been full of life were now barren and lifeless. Entire star systems seemed to vanish without a trace, and strange energy surges were detected in the depths of space. The laws of nature, which had once been predictable and reliable, were beginning to warp and distort in ways that no one could explain. Many speculated that these disturbances were the result of something much older and far more dangerous than anyone had imagined. Ancient records spoke of a dark force, an entity that fed on chaos, fear, and destruction, that lay dormant for millennia, waiting for the right moment to awaken. Some believed that the force had been unleashed when humanity left the Galactic Council, breaking the delicate balance that had held the universe together. The mere act of humanity withdrawing from the peacekeeping organization had set off a chain reaction that led to the galaxy's unraveling. Others thought it was a natural consequence of the Galactic Council's failure. Perhaps the universe, as it was, could no longer sustain itself without the leadership and unity the Council had once provided. Whatever the cause, the galaxy was now experiencing a breakdown of cosmic proportions. Entire sectors of space were being swallowed by unknown forces, and no one could predict when the next catastrophe would strike. Governments and empires that had once ruled with iron fists were now crumbling, unable to maintain order. Small factions, who had once been content to remain neutral, were now building their own defenses, preparing for the worst. Fear had taken root everywhere, and the once proud members of the Galactic Council were now in full retreat, unable to face the chaos that humanity had inadvertently set in motion. As the larger species fought to hold on to what little power they had left, the smaller factions began to see an opportunity. If the old powers were weakening, perhaps it was time for them to rise up. Some species had already begun to form uneasy alliances, seeking to carve out a new order in the midst of the chaos. But these alliances were fragile at best, and betrayal was never far behind. As the galaxy continued to descend into anarchy, no one knew who could be trusted. The only certainty was that the old ways were gone, and the future of the galaxy was uncertain. Yet, even in the midst of this dark age, some began to wonder if there was still hope. Could the galaxy be saved from the brink of collapse? Was there a way to restore balance and harmony? Some believed that the key to salvation lay in finding a new way forward, a way that did not rely on the old structures and powers that had brought the galaxy to its knees. But this was no easy task. The forces that had been unleashed were beyond anyone's comprehension, and no one knew where they would lead. In the end, the fate of the galaxy remained uncertain. The events set in motion by humanity's bold decision to leave the Galactic Council had triggered a chain reaction that no one could have predicted. And now, as the galaxy teetered on the edge of destruction, the question remained, would anyone be able to stop the descent into chaos before it was too late? With each passing day, the answer seemed more and more elusive. The galaxy was on the brink, and time was running out. Whether it would be torn apart by its own fear and panic, or whether a new hope could emerge from the ashes remained to be seen. The universe was in a state of flux, and the only thing that was certain was that nothing would ever be the same again. The galaxy had reached its breaking point, and now, it seemed, it was only a matter of time before the inevitable happened. The galaxy's collapse, though gradual, had reached a critical tipping point. It was no longer a matter of if the universe would descend into utter chaos, but when. The ripple effects of humanity's departure from the Galactic Council had triggered something far larger than anyone could have imagined. The once harmonious balance of power had been shattered, and no one knew how to pick up the pieces. In the wake of the initial panic, factions that had once coexisted peacefully now found themselves at each other's throats. With the collapse of the Council, The age-old alliances had fractured, and new, uncertain power dynamics began to form. The larger species, who had once been the central figures in the Council, had been reduced to a shadow of their former selves. Their power had been compromised, not only by the strange cosmic disruptions, but also by the fact that their former allies were now acting in their own self-interest. Trust had eroded, and without the authority of the Council to mediate, disputes between species turned deadly. The Zorak, whose once mighty psychic network had been their primary tool of influence, were now powerless. Their telepathic abilities, which had enabled them to dominate entire sectors of space, were now unreliable at best and completely disabled at worst. As their psychic channels flickered and failed, their leaders were forced to rely on primitive technology for communication. The High Command, once used to commanding with an effortless thought, was now reduced to sending messages through conventional, outdated methods. The breakdown of their mental connection was more than just a technical failure. It was a psychological blow to their very identity. This loss of control led the Zorak to adopt more extreme measures, desperate to restore their dominance. They began sending scouting missions to distant and uncharted sectors, seeking something, anything, that could explain their sudden vulnerability. Some believed that the universe itself had decided to reject them, that humanity's withdrawal from the Galactic Council had unleashed a force that was now punishing them for their centuries of dominance. Meanwhile, the Shalak, a species once known for their unyielding strength and military prowess, were also at a loss. Their warships, once considered invincible, were now stuck in a constant cycle of malfunction. At first, it was just a few ships, small systems failing, maintenance issues that could be written off as coincidences. But as time went on, it became clear that the problem was widespread. Entire fleets were grounded indefinitely as their engines burned out or their weapons systems malfunctioned. The very technology that had given them their strength had betrayed them. Worse still, their military was now in disarray, unable to maintain control over their territories. Desperation set in. In the aftermath, many of the smaller factions, species that had long been relegated to the fringes of the galaxy, began to assert themselves. They had always been dependent on the Galactic Council's stability, but now, with no central authority, they had no choice but to act in their own defense. The Vorgan, the peaceful species known for their vast knowledge and intellectual achievements, were the first to retreat fully into isolation, securing their borders and suspending all intergalactic trade. The galaxy's once robust economy now staggered as major trade routes were interrupted, causing starvation and unrest on many worlds that relied on these exchanges. For the Vorgan, the loss of security was too great to ignore. They had always relied on their neutrality, but now, surrounded by conflict, they could no longer afford to be passive. Their leaders began to gather, not to seek peace or understanding, but to form a strategic alliance to secure their future. They began to invest heavily in advanced technologies, seeking ways to protect their people from the unpredictable events that were shaking the galaxy. But as they did so, the atmosphere in the galaxy turned darker. In every corner of space, strange anomalies continued to appear. Entire systems would disappear overnight, swallowed by something, some force no one could identify. The signs of instability were impossible to ignore, and yet there was no concrete answer to the source of the disturbances. Scientists worked frantically, but each theory seemed to contradict the next. Some suggested it was a natural cosmic event, an energy fluctuation that, for reasons unknown, had been amplified to catastrophic levels. Others believed the universe was simply tired, that it had grown too old, and the laws that had governed it for millennia were beginning to unravel. But the most chilling theory, the one whispered in the darkest corners of the galaxy, was that humanity's departure from the Galactic Council had triggered the awakening of something ancient and dark, something beyond the understanding of any of the current species. This theory was not widely accepted, but it persisted in hushed conversations among those who feared the worst. Some spoke of a primordial entity, a force that had always been lurking in the shadows of the galaxy, waiting for the moment when the balance of power was broken. As the galaxy fell into a desperate scramble for survival, the question began to loom larger than ever. Could anything reverse the ongoing collapse? Could the fragile threads of civilization be restored, or were they destined to unravel completely? The collapse had already reached such a point that some believed the answer might be buried in the past, perhaps in the ruins of an ancient civilization, or a forgotten secret from a time long before the Galactic Council. Some of the smaller factions began to act, sending expeditions to investigate the most ancient and distant corners of the galaxy. These missions were often dangerous and ultimately unsuccessful, but the leaders of these small factions knew that they had little choice. As the Zorek and Shalek fumbled in their attempts to regain their power, these smaller factions began to take their fate into their own hands. And yet, even as they acted, the galaxy seemed to have lost all direction. Every attempt to restore balance was met with failure, and every corner of space felt like it was slipping further into the unknown. And all the while, the strange cosmic disturbances continued. Planets would blink out of existence, entire fleets would vanish into the void, and star systems were ripped apart as if the universe itself was rejecting its inhabitants. There was no explanation. No one could predict what would happen next. As the final pieces of the galaxy's once vibrant civilizations crumbled, one truth became clear: there was no going back. The universe was on the brink of something even darker, and with each passing day, it seemed less likely that anyone would survive the coming storm. Whether the galaxy would be destroyed or transformed into something else entirely remained to be seen, but one thing was certain: the actions of humanity had set in motion a chain of events that could never be undone. And so, the galaxy waited. The last whispers of the Council had long since faded. The question now was not who would rule, but whether anyone would survive the inevitable collapse that had already begun. Time was running out, and the universe seemed to be on the edge of something far more dangerous than any of its inhabitants had ever imagined.